Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending where you are joining us from in the world. And welcome to another DC live stream with me, your host, Wasim Debussy. And today we're going to be speaking about the fractional banking system. So, if those of you that have been to any of our events, you know that we actually speak a lot about the fractional banking system because it is the way that the banks work. And a lot of people in today's society don't actually understand how the fractional banking system works or how the banking system works at all. A lot of people believe that you've got your money in the bank, you can access it anytime, and it's always there. However, the reality is banks are not required to keep the full deposit that you put into your account on hand. They are only required to keep a fraction of it. Hence, it's called fractional banking system. So this is pretty much predominant in almost every economy in the world today, and most of those banks will use this system. So the way that this works is the banks, when you deposit money into the bank then goes out and lends part of it to somebody else, and therefore creating more money out of thin air. This is one way that they can expand the economy and reuse the same money while giving you a very small percentage interest rate, and they are charging much higher interest rates, which shows in the bank's profitability. Most of the banks around the world are extremely profitable, and they post billions and billions of dollars in profit every year. So let's look a little bit around the history about this and where it started. So first of all, the fractional banking system started around during the Great Depression, or after just before the Great Depression, and then they had a lot of problems during the Great Depression because people went in to try to withdraw all their money, which is what we call a bank run. So we're going to talk a little bit about what a bank run is today and where it's happened around the world and the catastrophic effect that's happened and whether this can happen in any society. So the concept of the fractional banking system came about from the gold trading era. So back in the day when humans used to use gold and silver and precious metal as ways of payment, then they would have what was called a goldsmith. The goldsmith would hold onto their gold and give them an interest. Or so what these goldsmiths would do, well, they would then give them a piece of paper that is an IOU, which just shows how much deposit they have. And then people went out and started using these pieces of paper to trade. Now, when that happened, people started, the goldsmiths started to realize, well, hang on a second, not everybody's going to need this deposit at the same time. So then the goldsmiths started lending out more gold than when they actually had in reserve. And this created the fractional banking system because people would go out. I would have an IOU that says I have 100 pieces of gold. I give that to someone that I bought something off. Then that person can take it back to the goldsmith and exchange the IOU for actual gold. But because many people weren't doing that and people were trading this paper as the IOUs, as a form of currency, that's when the goldsmiths decided that they can lend out more than they have. So since then, obviously, we've had the creation of fiat money, which is the paper money that we have, which was supposed to be backed by gold. And as you guys know, we've spoken about this a number of times. 1971, that backing was gone. Now, so when this started happening, governments started realizing that they need to be able to control this. So the first country to ever create a reserve bank was actually Sweden back in 1668. And this central bank, or this central reserve bank, had the power to regulate all the commercial banks. It had the power to have a reserve currency and also had the power to lend to commercial banks as a last resort, which is what we saw in 2008 with the big bailouts where governments and reserve banks just started giving money away to the commercial banks that were falling over to stop the catastrophic effect of what was happening in the global financial crisis. Now, the biggest threat to reserve banking is actually what is called a bank run. A bank run is when everybody wants to go in and withdraw their money. And then we've seen this in history. We've seen this in Greece. We've seen this in Sri Lanka. We've seen this in Lebanon recently, Sri Lanka recently, mainly Lebanon in the past, I think in the past 6 months or so, or less than a year, where people realized that the bank was printing so much money and the inflation was so high that people went to take their money out When the whole population went to try to take their money out of the bank, guess what happened? The banks could not pay that, and therefore they froze everybody's accounts, and people have lost some people have lost their whole life savings. I know I have family members myself that have lost over hundreds of thousands of dollars in the banking system in Lebanon. I also know other people in the community that have lost a lot of money because they thought they had it in a safe haven, and then it just went. So let's dive now into how this fractional banking system works. So first of all, when you deposit your money into an account, your bank account shows 100% deposit. So if you've deposited, say, $1,000 into your bank account, you look in your bank account, you look at your app, and that shows $1,000 in there. Now, the reality is that $1,000 is not there. The bank only has to have a reserve amount, which is dependent on different countries. Generally speaking, it's about 10%. So that means, your $1,000, the bank only has to keep $100 on hand, and then they can go and lend out the other $900. So let's look at this as an example. Number one, you decide to deposit $1,000 in your bank account. Your bank account shows $1,000. The bank then decides to lend 90% of that deposit. So they lend out $900 to person X. And then this person X uses that $900 that they borrowed, and they go purchase something from them. With it, sorry. So they go purchase something with it. They go to a merchant, they buy something. This merchant then sells the product. Then this merchant goes and puts $900 in their bank account. Now, the merchant's bank account now shows $900. Your bank account now shows $1,000. So all of a sudden, there's $1,900 in the system. Now, the merchant's bank can now lend 90% of that, which is $810. So then the merchant's bank takes that $900 that was deposited. Then they go lend out $810 to person Y. Now, all of a sudden, you've got $1,000, you've got $900, you've got $810 all available to be used, equaling $2,710 from just that $1,000 deposit. And this keeps going over and over and over and over again. And this is called the money multiplier. So the money multiplier actually measures the amount of commercial bank money that can be created using this specific fractional banking system. One of the best ways for you to work out the money multiplier is to, first of all, find out what is the minimum reserve that banks have to have in your country. And it does change from country to country. Some countries have 10%, some countries have 20%, some countries have less. So depending on where you are in the world, that reserve amount that the bank needs to have can be different to other countries. But let's say, for example, you live in a country where your government has decided that the banks have to have 10%. What you do is you grab the amount deposited, then you times it by 1/10%. And then that shows you how much money they can create. So from $100,000 in a 10% reserve fractional banking system, that $100,000 now equates to $1 million of money that the bank can actually use and lend out to people. And this is how banks create money out of thin air. And this is how banks use your money to lend to others over and over and over again, getting interest on money they never actually had, and also giving the depositor a much smaller amount of interest. I want you to ask yourself this: how much does a bank usually give you in terms of interest? If you're living in the Western world, you'd be lucky to get something like 1% these days. But let's look at how many times the bank lends that money over and over again. When you start doing the calculations, they can actually make up to 180% per annum on your deposit. So if you deposit $10,000 and then they lend out they can lend out up to 9 times of that to someone else on a credit card, 20% interest, they could be making up to 20% returns on that, while giving you 1 or 2% per annum return. This has been one of the biggest criticisms of the fractional reserve banking system, is because it allows banks to continuously charge interest on money they don't have. While we have to pay back the full amount, they actually don't have to do that. They can just create more and more money from all the money that they get, and continue making interest on it over and over again. Plus, this system is actually an inflationary system. It's what causes inflation in the world. Because if your money keeps being reused and recycled and gets multiplied over and over again, there's more money in the economy. There's more money in the economy that usually increases the prices of goods and services. Now, in the past, most banks, in history, banks used to have up to 60% of reserves. Today, on average, most banks hold around 6% reserves. So that means they've got 94% of the money that they're supposed to have in their vaults out in the world, and they're getting interest on that, but they're showing that they have 100% in there and in everybody's bank account. So, what are the alternatives to fractional banking systems? Well, number one, a lot of governments, as you guys know, we've spoken about this. A lot of governments are looking at using a central bank digital currency. So they're looking at using blockchain and whatnot to be able to create a digital currency for the government and for the Reserve Bank, which, as you guys know, we've spoken a lot about the dangers of reserve currencies because of the amount of control that a central entity can have over that money. They can take it out of your bank account anytime they want. They can, ban you from buying certain things, giving you social credit scores and whatnot. There's a lot of dangers in that. An alternative system can be a 100% reserve system. However, if that happens, then the banks will no longer be paying the interest that they're paying, and also it will not promote economic growth, but will actually promote economic shrinkage, which is something obviously governments don't want because they want us to continue growing. So without the fractional banking system, your relationship with the bank could be quite different to what it is right now. The banks might even charge you to have money in there, and there'll also be a lot less money for them to use and a lot less money for them to profit on. So I don't know what the future is going to hold for this. It'll be interesting to see where we go because we have seen countries starting to collapse because of the fractional banking system. We've seen countries that are over leveraged, they can't pay off their debt, and then they start freezing people's accounts, and they start freezing their population's account, and people do a bank run, and they end up with situations like Lebanon, where Lebanon is now over 75% of their population are living below the poverty line. So that's today's live stream around the fractional banking system. Looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow at our usual live stream where we go through news highlights, Twitter highlights, as well as adoption highlights. That's it for me today, guys. Have a great night, and as always, stay crypto.